IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. We meet you today on the 130th anniversary of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's birth. We are going to be talking about Pandit Nehru's foreign policy legacy in the Indian context. As a designated child of the office on the occasion of Children's Day, let me welcome both Manoj and Sankalp. So let's just start with a bit of a provocative question, guys. So one thing that I've seen very often on a certain part of Twitter is that if Sardar Patel had been India's first Prime Minister, then our foreign policy would have followed such a different trajectory that we'd definitely be a superpower now. So let's open the floor to your opinion, Sankalp.
See, first thing we have to recognize is this. Patel and Nehru were never against each other. They worked hand in hand. They were both Gandhiji's disciples. They were working together since 1920s. So that concept itself needs to be challenged, first. Second, Patel, had he become Prime Minister, would be 72 and he was facing health issues. So I'm not sure whether he would have been able to carry on the burden of the office of Prime Ministership and also carrying the entire nation together for as long as Nehru would have done. Because you see, in 1948, Patel had a severe heart attack. So if you have a Prime Minister who is, in weak health, I'm not sure how it would have benefited the country. Although he was a able supporter of Nehru, he made sure that, organization remains with Nehru. But I think it was Nehru all along. And it was known since 1940s, right? I mean, when Patel was there, Gandhiji himself was there, other stalwart leaders like Rajendra Prasad, Rajgopalachari, everybody was there and Nehru was a designated successor.
So, if we can kind of tease out especially the foreign policy angle of it, right? So, the word Nehruvian is used almost in a pejorative sense today to kind of declare that people are wool-headed dreamers with very idealistic expectations from the international space. Did Nehru's own foreign policy, his own behavior support this idea? Do you guys see him as Nehruvian?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of what you've just said connects to this earlier question also about Patel and Nehru. I mean, I'm not a historian and I have a very limited understanding of the internal dynamics of the Congress at that point of time. But from what I understand is that, yes, there were, of course, differences between Nehru and Patel on certain policy issues, which is but natural. I mean, to assume that any government or party will have unanimity throughout is actually dangerous if that happens. So there were differences in their opinions. Specifically on, say, China, which is something that I researched, there were differences on their opinions. This ties into this other notion, and that's the myth that's been carried on, right? That Nehru was this woolly-headed idealist who saw third worldism and non-alignment and, India being this moral force and didn't really concern himself with hard power and those sorts of things. To me, that's a complete misnomer. There were obviously certain limitations. There were obviously certain priorities that he had. He saw India as a major power in the world scene, and he also saw material capabilities as important for that. Could you gain the kind of material capabilities in that short span of time, given how he saw India as a major power? Of course not. And that was one of the sort of misfits between his aspiration and the material strength that India had. I think India under Nehru internationally punched way above its weight. We were nowhere where we should have been and we punched way above our weight because of multiple issues. And part of that was because of the certain moral force of this movement of decolonization and this example that the Gandhian ideal of, non-violence and so on and so forth set forth. Despite that, obviously, our partition and our independence struggle was very violent in many ways.
So let me just pause you there for 1 second, Manoj. So if I can restate this, essentially, what you're saying is that Nehru's third worldism, though it's seen often as an example of him not being connected to global realities, might actually be a great example of how well he understood the global discourse around colonialism.
Absolutely. I think it was very, the word opportunistic seemed pejorative, but there was a certain realism to what he was doing. Did your ideology of India being a moral force and so on and so forth and, non-violence and all that fit into that realist paradigm very well, serve your interests well? Of course it did. And that's why that ideology was leveraged. when push came to shove, it's not like, for example, when we went to the UN Security Council, when we went to the UN in terms of in 1948 with regard to Pakistan and Kashmir, it was not an ideologically taken decision because we suddenly felt that, this is a dispute and the UN must decide, and or we decided on plebiscite as one option because we suddenly felt this way. Plebiscite was discussed much before in many other contexts in regards to different states which were contested. And I think Srinath Raghavan speaks quite extensively about this in his podcast. So if anybody is interested in the details on that, you should listen to him. But the broad idea is this. You saw very realistically what your interests were. Were there failures in Nehruvian foreign policy? Of course. I mean, it would be foolish to say that there were no failures. But given the material strength that India had, India during Nehru's years punched way above its weight. We made a lot of mistakes, but predominantly there's one overarching structure that Nehru left behind for us, which even today dominates our foreign policy. I mean, you can call it very differently by different names. It was non-alignment 2.0 at one point in time. Today it's multi-alignment, not non-alignment. But that as a framework of India being this autonomous power center in the world, a regional power with global reach, which is not necessarily aligned to any power bloc, continues to persist even today.
That's a very good way of putting this, regional power with global reach idea, and I'll probably come back to this later in our conversation. But I think, Sankalp, you had a point to make?
Yeah, so see, this idea of idealism also needs to be broken down, because what happens is, what Nehru was doing, recently TV Paul has termed it as the soft balancing, basically, if we look at in the IR sense. And in a way, you could play off one superpower against the other. Second point was that regarding India's connections with third worldism and not being connected with the global realities, let me tell you a fascinating story in 60s when non-alignment was at its peak. African countries were becoming independent, and many African leaders were, especially Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, wanted to push for more radical stance on decolonization, whereas Nehru had seen what happens with the problems between superpowers, and Nehru wanted to go for disarmament. And that was the first major rupture in the history of non-aligned movement, which is not generally talked about, but which clearly demonstrated that Nehru was more important about superpower politics, more interested in that, and also connected to that.
That's a very interesting point. And I think the disarmament angle of India's early foreign policy has not really gone into considering that we were operating in a very, very tense security environment. The Cold War is literally unfolding in front of us.
But interestingly, although pushing for disarmament, India also made sure that it had adequate infrastructure for developing nuclear power. So when we thank other prime ministers for tasting weapons, the foundation for that was laid by Nehru.
Again, that sort of underscores the realism of his approach.
Absolutely.
Right? It was not woolly-headed to the extent that, we are going to lay down our arms and put up these white flags and the world is going to follow us and we are all going to live happily floating doves in the sky.
And imagine in the garb of atoms for peace, we secure nuclear technology, nuclear material for us. I mean, that is like...
I think there's a lot of historical judgment which is sort of unfair. And a lot of that actually now goes back to a couple of things, and they go back to things regarding China and Kashmir. Because those are sort of those big legacy issues which are left behind, for which obviously blame is put on Nehru's doorstep, and to some degree it's legitimate.
Justified, yeah.
It's justified that there is a share of blame that he should carry with himself. On China specifically, yes, there were clear mistakes that were made. There were clear political missteps. There was a clear misunderstanding of the mood of the Communist Party. There were clear policy missteps in terms of how the forward policy was undertaken. So there were certain missteps that were made, yes. This idea that Nehru decided that if we acquiesce to China and give the PRC this UN seat and this and that and do all of this for them, they will be nice to us. And to me, that's a little bit overblown. If you look at his first speech, sort of just as India is becoming independent, you hold this Asian Relations Conference and Nehru makes a speech over there. The speech is available online for people to go and read. And what you read in it is a person who is looking at the world realistically and saying, look, Asia has these ancient civilizations. As decolonization is happening, these civilizations are going to come into their own, and therefore they will essentially become their own power centers. We will have differences because we have differences. Yes, yet there are certain common grounds that we can work on. To me, that's not woolly-headed idealism. That's a very rooted in realism understanding of the need for cooperation despite differences. And I think that makes sense.
Absolutely.
I just want to come in here regarding, again, breaking down idealism. There are again two examples from Nehruvian era where we can see Nehru was not averse to the use of force. First was in 1950 when there was a crisis with with Pakistan. Nehru had threatened the use of force. And that was the first instance of coercive diplomacy. Again, Srinath Raghavan has explained it beautifully in his book. But we imagine that 2001, 2002 was the first instance of coercive diplomacy. That was not. It was 1950. Second, Goa. I mean, despite saying to Kennedy that we will not use force, you are essentially using force, 6 months down the line. And you realize that, entire NATO can come back to sort of, haunt you, because Portugal was a NATO member then.
It seems like Nehru's policy was to speak gently but carry a big stick.
Exactly. And that's also seen in the context of what we did with Bhutan and Nepal, where we ended up signing these peace and friendship treaties, which shaped our relationship with these countries going forward. But this was essentially looking at securing our periphery. This was not some, again, woolly-headed idealism. This was about securing your periphery. And today, yes, those frameworks are under pressure with both of these countries. And that's because of an increasingly assertive China in this region and the option that it provides to these countries. And also changes that have taken place in terms of the relationship between the two countries. But those were the treaties that laid the foundations for a secure, far more stable periphery for India. And many, like Sankalp will tell you, many have sort of termed the signing of those treaties as sort of an imperial perspective on Indian foreign policy, where Nehru sort of inherits this vision of imperial Raj, sort of this British India, which is imperial, which views its periphery as its sphere of influence. And therefore, he also pursues very similar policies. And that doesn't sound like an idealistic notion to me, right?
That's something I find quite surprising. And this, while you guys were talking earlier also, just the way that Indian elites after independence approached the whole project, they didn't seem to think at all that we were recently colonized country. They're very much like, hey, look, we studied in Oxford and we are going to go out to the United Nations. We are going to make these assertive speeches. And that actually ended up helping our foreign policy.
Yeah, maybe that was the only time when India realistically felt that it is a great power and it was behaving like one, although it didn't have material capacities. Because the way, imagine you assuring Nepal or Bhutan or Sikkim of security. Now, who does that?
Exactly.
You need to have material capacity, but you also need that imagination of sorts.
I can't help but feel that even though India's material capacity is kind of improved, because of the way that our foreign policy seems to kind of meander now, that all the blame for foreign policy not paying off very well ends up falling on Nehru, and that's kind of unfair.
It's unfair, yes, I agree, but I also sort of temper that by saying that, look, the fact that there was this mismatch between how we were acting in our aspiration and our material capacity also created problems in terms of achieving certain objectives. And the China case is a perfect example for that, the 62 war, is because we were behaving, like I said, we were punching far above our weight, and that's great, but until you come to a point where you start to buy your own, so you start to drink your own Kool-Aid and you start to believe your own nonsense, and you end up in a position where there's a big gap and you sort of miss that gap. In that sense, I think over the years subsequently, after Nehru, and particularly today, we are at a point where I think there is a little bit of a better realization of where we stand materially. And why do I say that is because, if you look at what's happening between the US and China today, and if you look at how India is trying to navigate that particular sort of shift that's happening geopolitically, we're far more cautious. Yes, it may seem like you're meandering, but given your asymmetry of power with some of these countries, and you might have very high-minded objectives, and you might want to project yourself as a great power, but given the limitations of your material capacity, you are going to be far more cautious in your actions. So, for example, in the Maldives, while a year or so ago there might have been a consideration that India needs to intervene militarily, it was good that we didn't in hindsight. It was good that we didn't. So I think there is somewhat a better sense of balance between aspiration and capacity. I don't think in that era that balance was really there. Because I think we were aspiring for far more than what in terms of the capacity that we had, which was not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that once you start to lose a sense of what that gap is like, you can end up making far more devastating mistakes than you would otherwise.
I want to come in here again, but in a different context. I agree with what Manoj is saying. While speaking of Nehru's foreign policy, we are only talking about his approach to world affairs. We should also consider what he did with the foreign ministry. Because he was a foreign minister for 17 years. He used to hold this State of the Nation sort of address every year, he would present his report card of sorts to the nation, which was a good practice, which was stopped somehow. Institutionalizing the entire ministry. It was in Nehru's time that you had historical division in the MEA, where you had people like S. Gopal who would sort of, work on historical aspects of foreign policy.
But it's something that we don't do today. Right?
Even now, I mean, I don't know when it was wound up, during I think Indira Gandhi's time, but so regarding China case, S. Gopal was sent to India House in Britain and, they accessed British archives and they built proper case for Indian claims in certain parts of the boundary. Although Chinese didn't regard that as valid, but you had that sort of imagination as well. He would personally sort of interview people who would come for foreign service, who were selected, ambassadors were briefed personally by the Prime Minister. These might seem small things now, but when India is shaping its own approach to the world, I think they are quite significant.
I think in that earlier, another thing that Nehru did, which is very, very good from this particular point of view of building India's foreign policy capacity, was that he used to write letters. And he used to write copiously to leaders, state leaders in India, to inform them what India is doing at the international stage, why we are doing so, and to essentially make sure that they are informed and empowered as things go forward. And I think this is fundamental, again, because a lot of, and this is, I mean, it ties into this modern day concept where, we in the office, we keep talking about this thing about Indian states needing to have certain kind of foreign policy approaches. Pranay talks about this quite a bit. And you won't have that until you have capacity. And this practice that Nehru had, where he would inform states and he was trying to take states together, was extremely important as a legacy. I can see why, as things have become far more complex, as things have become as India's sort of role internationally increases far more, it becomes difficult to continue that for the Prime Minister to be sitting and writing letters copiously. Also, Nehru was a scholar so it was not like he was
used to writing that
much. He was used to
writing
that much, So I think it helps if you're that sort of an intellectual who does some of these things. But even then, just the policy of keeping state leaderships, state legislatures informed, I think that's a good practice. And I think that if there is some way where we can sort of continue to institutionalize some of these things, it would be really useful because states would be far better informed. Foreign policy is not just about what the MEA does anymore or
even PMO now.
Yeah, even PMO, of course.
It's like expecting Brussels to conduct Europe's foreign policy, right?
Exactly. It's you need far more actors and you need far more inputs and you need states to play a role in terms of, if it's simply as attracting investment, states should know how you go about some of these things, what are the positions, what are the risk factors, and so on and so forth. And in that, if you're engaging with the center, and the center is willfully engaging with you on some of these issues, it really helps. It really helps. So I think Nehru was great in some of those areas where he sought actually to build India's overall diplomatic capacity. And again, that stems from his belief that India was a great power and was to play a great power role internationally. In many ways, we are still not where he probably envisioned India's role internationally to be. It's expanded greatly, but we're still not there. And that has a lot to do with material capacity.
So y'all are making me miss my cha-cha at this point. But okay, so if I can just quickly summarize what I've learned from this whole conversation, right? So Nehru was actually a lot more of an imperialist than we'd like to believe he is. His push even for third worldism
Curzonian imperialist.
Curzonian
imperialist.
Just imperialist. His push, his so-called idealist look at the third world and decolonization was actually based on a very real and critical understanding of the global security environment. He did some absolutely great work in terms of institutionalizing Indian foreign policy and attempting to decenter it. But the one area where he doesn't seem to have done that great was actually dropping that kind of rose-tinted view of the Raj as the dominant power of South Asia and so on and so forth. And I think a really, really great example of this was 62. Now, Manoj, you mentioned it earlier. I kind of want to get a little deeper into the events that led to 62 planning out the way it did. And considering that Nehru was not the kind of man who was shy of apologizing. He did admit that he'd made some mistakes. Did he reorient India's foreign policy in any way? What is your... there seem to be two broad eras practically of Nehruvian policy, right? So you have the early optimistic imperialist phase, I'm probably oversimplifying this, of course, and the later more what have I done with China sort of phase.
Yeah, I think as the sort of 50s rolled on and as his conversations with Zhou Enlai started to go south, there was a greater realization in even Nehru that, look, this is a serious challenge that we have. I mean, that's the difference with Nehru and Patel that people draw up, right? Patel was much earlier to realize that this is going to be a difficult... In 1950 itself, once the PLA had moved into Tibet, Patel had realized that, look, this is going to pose a serious challenge to us. But as the sort of engagement went on, Nehru sort of was also quite quick to realize that, look, this is going to be a serious challenge for us. Did he believe that conflict was inevitable? Of course not. He saw multiple pathways in which conflict could be avoided. Yet, did he believe that he needed to project strength, he needed to secure our frontiers, and he needed to do some of those things? Of course, yes. That's where the forward policy came into being. And we've done a podcast on this also, so where I'd sort of draw the line in terms of what went wrong in 1962, apart from militarily, how we, didn't necessarily plan effectively and how people weren't ready. What went wrong broadly was the fact that we misread the mood that was developing in China. We misread the PRC's approach. We misread the PRC's understanding of India and the internal dynamics going on in the PRC. And I think that was where our fundamental mistake lied. I think that sort of, once the war ended and the defeat that India suffered in that conflict, sort of cast a heavy shadow on Nehru's own psyche, and he died very soon afterwards. And I think this sense that he'd been betrayed, because he'd invested so much. I think that's where, again, this notion of romanticism also comes in, the fact that, he felt betrayed, not realizing that, the global system is anarchic and there is realpolitik and all of that. I think he genuinely felt that you would not see conflict between these two countries. Yet I don't think he was blind to the fact that there couldn't be. Because as the 50s had rolled on and as things soured, there was a realization that this is a possibility. The failure to prepare for that possibility is where I think the blame rests with him.
And speaking of corrective steps, I think as the war was going on, India reached out to the United States, asking to sort of, send their military personnel and as much assistance as they could. I mean, I think that was the end of Nehruvian non-alignment when, you have these American soldiers coming into India. But he was not shy of asking that help.
He was not shy of asking for help. He wrote to Kennedy at that point in time, and he also spoke to. He was even exchanging letters with the Chinese leadership, and there was a proposal because the war went on. It was a month-long conflict. I think for the first week or so there was fighting, and then there was a lull in the fighting, and then there was again fighting later on in November until the 20th, 21st, when the Chinese eventually declared a unilateral ceasefire. I think even at that point in time there was a proposal from Zhou Enlai, from what I remember, to meet somewhere away from the media glare and to talk about things, because even he didn't, there were elements in the Chinese leadership which saw this conflict as problematic. And it just didn't happen. Nehru, from what I remember reading, even we were talking about this at the time, when Nehru was given that proposal as a written document, written on a page by his interlocutor, he essentially tore it up and he said, no, I don't want to even listen to this. So that's how sort of dismayed he was, which you can look at and say as, a lack of a certain political naivety, because you would assume that states would be serving their interests. But you can also see that as, something where you've invested in and you realize that it hasn't worked out for you and you've made a mistake.
Sunk cost.
Yeah, sunk cost.
Interestingly, what India did in 50s helped India after 62 war. Because many of these countries came out openly in favor of India. Non-aligned countries. Although many didn't, but many also came out. There was something called Colombo Proposals. Now, Colombo Proposals came out because of a conference that Nehru had organized in 49 for Indonesia's independence. And, Colombo powers were essentially Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Indonesia were there. So that is something that we tend to underestimate, that, because we lost in China against China, entire foreign policy was a failure. That's not how it works out.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. So this really complicates our understanding of Nehru and I think generally of 20th century international relations. Thank you guys so much for joining me. But before we wrap up, final comments, Sankalp?
So interestingly, in India, we have this vilification of Nehru, and also that non-alignment was a useless tool of foreign policy. India lost because of non-alignment. All of that nonsense goes on. But interestingly, Henry Kissinger came out in 2014 in full support of India's non-alignment. He wrote that for a newly independent country, that was probably the sanest way to sort of, structure its foreign policy, and it served India well. So
I'm going to add on to that, and I'm going to make a personal comment about that. In 2002, 2003, when I was doing my master's, I had done a paper on whether non-alignment was ideologically driven or whether it was based on national interests. And I didn't get a great grade on that because I argued that it was
not getting a great grade
because I had argued that it was national interest driven. So, Professor, here you go. It was national interest driven.
The one thing that I think really stayed with me through this conversation was the image of Nehru tearing up Chou En-lai's message. I think it's a appropriately complex note to end an episode about a complex man. So thank you both for joining me, and thank you so much for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hi, I'm Sarayu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar.
And we are the hosts of the Ganatantra podcast.
On this podcast, we speak to academics, social scientists, journalists, and activists to find out what's actually going on in Indian politics.
On this podcast, we stay away from personality politics, intrigue, and gossip, and instead focus on the data, research, and analysis that drives all this.
So tune in to the Ganatantra podcast, where new episodes are out every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Family businesses get a bad rap. At one time, they were looked down on for getting rich, for being too ambitious. Today, they're still looked down on, but for not being ambitious enough. Not agile enough, not modern enough, too traditional in their mindset. The biggest brands and business houses in the country started out as humble family businesses. It's the way India has done business. Join Sonu Bhasin in conversation with stalwarts of Indian family businesses on the Inheritors podcast series by Bloomberg Quint. Discuss the highs and lows, the needs and pressure points of building a business legacy that spans generations.